Zoom in here, Kevin. I know you guys in the drinking game needed the drink, so I said that anyway. Alec, Peirce, Scuba Tech Tips. Here we go. Now, this is another myth. Yeah, scuba myth. Misunderstanding, I call them. And it's a very common one. So common, in fact, that this goes back to the 60s. Yeah, the 60s, you probably don't remember the 60s, but the 60s were like 80 years ago. 40 and 20, 60 years ago, 60 years ago. That's kind of handy. 60s. In 1960 or thereabouts, a fellow by the name of Sam Lecoq, a French fellow living in Southern California, Sam Lecoq, who I know quite personally. We have pictures of Sam Lecoq and I chatting about things and so on. He had worked in several of the big companies, U.S. Divers, Healthways, several companies. And finally, he started a company of his own called Sportsways. And he was very innovative. He made some neat stuff. He made some weird stuff too. I remember pretty weird stuff. He made some neat stuff. Look up Sportsways. He made the first SPG, submersible pressure gauge, in case you weren't sure what that stands for, submersible. Now, we had pressure gauges prior to that. When I started diving in 58 and 60, we had a pressure gauge on the surface. And you put the pressure gauge on the tank, you check the air, tank's full, turn it off, bleed it, put your regulator back on and jump on the water. The regulator only had one hose, the important one. It came from the tank to your mouth. That's it. There was no pressure gauge or none of that other stuff. So Sam Lecoq was the first one to make a submersible pressure gauge. It was called the sea-vue, C-S-E-A-vue, V-U-E. Sam wasn't very good at spelling, but anyway, sea-vue gauge. And it was very similar to ones we have today. It had a hose. The biggest noticeable difference was that the head was on the end, so you looked at the gauge like this, and also it didn't swivel, so it wasn't completely convenient. But it wasn't very long before other improvements came along with Sam and other companies as well, because they were very, very popular. Prior to that, divers were dependent on their reserve, and it wasn't just perfect. So the SPG caught on pretty quickly. Improvements were made. But even back then, there was a potential problem. You see, the pressure gauge works using a Borden tube. You have to look that up. Borden, B-O-U-R-D-O-N, Borden tube mechanism inside, which is basically a small brass tube that's curved in a circle. And when you increase the pressure on the inside, like when you turn the air on, then that brass tube, it tries to straighten. It always does that. And when you let the pressure off, it curls up again. And that movement with a little series of chains and levers and gears can be turned into a gauge, so the pressure goes up and down. It works like that. But that little brass tube was the problem, because it's a little bit fragile. It's a brass tube, very thin brass. It would bend many, many times and not break. Thin. So it is not unknown for the Borden tube to leak. It could burst or more likely develop a leak from the repeated use. And when it leaks, obviously it's high pressure air coming out of the tank, directly from the tank, right? Because that's what you're measuring. When it leaks, then what happens is the case of the SPG, this case here, gets very high pressure on the inside. The pressure increases very quickly on the inside. Now in the old days, originally, and you still get them actually, some companies, you still get, the case was made of steel, brass actually, but made of brass or steel, and plated, so nice chrome maybe. And many of them early on had a glass, real glass, screw-in cover. Yeah, there was an O-ring, and then a piece of glass, and then a screw-on cap that held it together. Yeah, it was pretty neat looking, and they were quite rugged. But as many things have today, the heavy steel, real glass, and all that kind of stuff is long gone. So the pressure gauges today, submersible pressure gauges, they are almost all a modular case. It's a plastic case. So there's the black part, and then the front is glued on, bonded on there. So it's permanent. It can't be opened. It can't be adjusted. You can't adjust it anyway. Even the old ones you couldn't really adjust. So now you have a modular case. And with the modular case, the same problem could occur. It is possible, even with a modern pressure gauge like this, for the pressure inside this case to increase. Now, made of plastic, of course, just the same as the glass in the old ones, this case could actually explode. So the myth that we're trying to dispel here is, can my submersible pressure gauge, my SPG, explode? The answer technically is yes, it could explode. But knowing that that's a possibility and not wanting that problem, manufacturers have come up with a very simple solution. Sure, they have a safety blowout disc. It's just like the safety blowout disc on your tank. You know, your tank, when the pressure gets too high, there's a brass disc on the back that will eventually pop and let the pressure out without the tank exploding. Good idea, right? Well, submersible pressure gauge manufacturers are just as smart, they're no dumber than tank manufacturers. So they also have a safety blowout disc. It's actually, I guess you should call it a safety blowout rubber plug. Yeah, look on the back of your pressure gauge if you can get to it. Look on the very back. Zoom in, Kevin. Time for a drink. Right in the very back. You see in the middle of that little black rubber plug? I'm going to turn it slightly. You see that? That's a little black rubber plug. Now, if you took something sharp, you could actually dig that rubber plug out of there. Don't do it, because it'll ruin it. The gauge will leak, get water inside, and ruin the gauge, so don't take it out. But that little plug in there is designed so that the pressure inside the case gets too high from a leak or a break in the gauge somehow, that little rubber plug will blow out. So the gauge won't blow up. So the myth is, will my SPG explode? Technically, yes. In practice, no. It will not explode. Can't. However, let me add one more small thing. In training, you may very well have been taught to turn the pressure gauge away from you, like so. So the pressure gauge is facing away from you. Think about it for a minute. A little black rubber plug, about the size of a .22 bullet. And if something goes wrong, and it most commonly would happen, in fact, when you first turn the air on, pressure zooms through there, that's when that little plug is going to come flying out and pop you, hopefully, on the forehead or someplace else where it won't cause permanent damage. So the myth is, no, it won't explode because it is a safety disc. But there's another myth. You should turn your pressure gauge away from you. No, you should not turn it away from you. In fact, the boots, you know, the rubber part that covers the gauge, it makes it look really nice. This rubber thing here that covers the gauge. Most boots, in the back of the boot, will have a hole, see it? A little hole like that right there. So that rubber plug is not prevented from blowing out. And if you ever turn it away from you, it'll come right through that hole and still hit you in the eye, or the ear, or wherever. So when your instructor told you to turn the gauge away when you're turning the air on, now he may have heard that from his instructor a long time prior to that, because the old pressure gauges with the brass cases, what would happen with them, no safety plug, what would happen is the pressure increased too much, the glass cover would fly off. You want it pointed away from you. That's not the case anymore. Some more stuff to think about, huh? So what do you do when you turn the air on? Well, just make sure that the gauge is away from you. Now, you should just make sure it's away from you. Turn your face away, put the gauge behind you, put it down behind your back when you turn the pressure on, and then you're perfectly safe. Anyway, scuba myth. Will my SPG explode? No, it won't explode. It's got a safety disc. Just something interesting. Maybe something in there that you didn't know about. Maybe your instructor told you some information that needs to be updated. Okay, that's it. Alec Peirce, Scuba Tech Tips at Dive Kawartha in Lindsay, my hometown. Yeah. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.